So many, too many games, too much hype, brain lose focus, long time in this industry, hype machine, take over. Video games is a business of hype. Hype we all lap up willingly, most of the time, much as we try to pretend we're all-knowing renegades who will stick it to the man at a moment's notice. Buying into the hype in the most part is, well, it's just there, a thing, an element of it. We get to be useful idiots for a bit and a publisher gets to make more money than it otherwise would have. But sometimes it goes a step beyond hype. It gets to a point where the game being promised is one that won't just be good, it won't just be great, it will actively change things. Always be wary, dear traveller, especially of the sort of hype that promises to make things better for you. Be it multi-level marketing, essential oils, or wait, no, that's the same thing. But basically anything that relies on the decidedly cultish technique of making you think whatever's being promised is exactly what you need. It rarely is. And in the case of these 5 games, well, the hype promised they'd all change gaming forever. Arguably some did just that, at least in some respects, but they were all resounding failures. Speaking of listening closely to hype and lapping up every word I say, here's an actual, real advert. FANHOME won't send M. Bison round to murder you, as far as I'm aware, but this new brand will send you magazines full of in-depth info and articles, alongside either pre-assembled figures or models for you to build from the likes of the Marvel Universe, Star Wars, and, as you may have guessed, Street Fighter. What's this got to do with you? Me? Brutal unprovoked figurine assault? Well, if you follow the link that's on screen and below in the description and subscribe using the promo code PROMOSTREET, not only will you get a magazine alongside a different officially licensed Street Fighter figurine every month, you'll also get 4 exclusive figures of Ryu, Cammy, Ken and Chun-Li, or Chunners as those of us in the know call her. Bit more gumph, sure. Each figure stands around 9 to 14 centimeters, not meters, that'd be too big, and features finely detailed hand-painted detail. The magazine itself covers the characters, the history, the little snippets of info and more about everything Street Fighter, and it comes with posters. I love posters, almost as much as I love hiding from Bison. Again, all you need to do is follow this link and subscribe using the promo code PROMOSTREET for 4 exclusive figurines. So exclusive I don't even have them here with me, thus meaning I'm safe from their attacks. For now. Rise of the Robots was a fighting game that came out on 8 formats in late 1994 through to early 1995. 7 formats if you banned both Amigas into one, though only a Philistine would do that. 8 versions of one game released over the space of about 7 months, the lead up to which was, well, it's a story of mega big hype. The many releases were prefaced with TV and cinema adverts. There were beauty shots of the game's rendered and ray-traced robots adorning billboards real people would see when out driving to buy custard and ham. There was an advertising onslaught. It was everywhere. Cross-media tie-ins were planned with a novelization of the game releasing and plans in place at one point for toys and comics, even an animated series based on the game. Is it's surprising, then, that the hype around Rise of the Robots had us thinking in the mid-90s that this was the second coming? We were seeing in-depth features across multiple magazines on how such detailed graphics could be made on contemporary hardware. Even Kids Gaming magazine show Bad Influence had a few minutes going over the technicalities of the developer's use of automated animation alongside handcrafted keyframes. It was an absolute onslaught, all the time, everywhere, for months in 1994. Even my beloved Amiga Power was taken in to some extent, willfully printing quotes from the game's marketing person like this. By including intelligence factors and combining them with motivation, the robots will respond differently to the changing course of each bout. For instance, if a robot knows that you've been damaged, it'll attack with more power and with less consideration of its own chances of damage. Similarly, when a robot's damaged, it'll spend most of its time in defense. An interior designer was even hired to craft the game's environments for some reason. Seemingly everything about the game's creation was done to be boasted about, to be pushed out to the press and fed to us gullible players as we got thirstier and thirstier for more. it had music from Brian May, the guy from Queen. Edge featured Rise of the Robots on the front cover of one of its earliest issues, going into plenty of detail about the then upcoming game, and featuring whoppers of quotes like this one from the game's lead designer Sean Griffiths. "We're using robots that fight and act unusually with a very high level of artificial intelligence that has never been seen before. We'll definitely have one over on Street Fighter 2. Want some more from him? Okay then. "I wanted to do an interactive movie type game, but I wanted to make a good game out of it, as opposed to having brilliant images and a dire game." It was endless, relentless hype. Everything about Rise of the Robots would change fighting games forever. The artificial intelligence was so next level you'd think Skynet had taken up residence in your SNES. As Edge wrote, "With other beat-em-ups, if you found you were successful with a foot sweep, you could continue to use it. But this system actually tots up all the statistics in the background for particular moves, and if you get good at a foot sweep, then your opponent will act more aggressively towards that move. It will block it more or jump out of the way and counterattack." But it wasn't just learning, and it wasn't just pretty, and it wasn't just an interactive movie with an awesome game attached. Rise of the Robots was, we were being told, so much more than you'd ever seen before. "This isn't just a Street Fighter, it has gameplay that has never been seen before and graphics that have never been seen before. It's the next generation," a PR person, probably the same one who spoke to Amiga Power, told Edge. When Rise of the Robots did finally release in those 7 months of different versions, PC, Amiga 1200, Amiga CD32, SNES, Mega Drive, Game Gear, 3DO and CDI, as well as an abandoned arcade version that failed location tests apparently due to issues with stability of the hardware itself, in those months we realised 2 very important things. Firstly, the game was absolutely irredeemably awful. The advertising spend for Rise of the Robots was pervasive, let's put it that way, and the pre-launch barrage of hype drew in many a gullible youngster and the present buying adults in their life. The game was truly otherworldly bad. Your moveset consisted of a handful of awkward punches and kicks and some awful special moves, but none of this mattered as the majority, in fact all, your opponents could be beaten by just hitting them with flying kicks repeatedly. Not that you'd last long doing it any other way, as your opposition was so wildly overpowered they would knock you unconscious in 3 or 4 hits, likely because there was no room for the much vaunted AI given so much memory had been taken up by those true next-gen graphical styles, which looked a bit clunky in the finished game. It was just empty and boring and genuinely stupid and very, very bad. And secondly, what we learned from Rise's launch was that some publications really did suffer from money shoved down the throatitis. Perennial Gaming Magazine Favourite Computer and Video Games awarded Rise of the Robots 91% and stated, "The SNES version is a landmark in console games." Confusingly, CU Amiga magazine wrote in the actual words bit of the review, "Where Rise comes in for most criticism is its gameplay or lack of it." But the score bit of the review put the number 81 followed by a percent mark. Other high scores littered the landscape, with suspicion arising not because the scores were high, but because oftentimes the actual reviews were much more critical than you'd expect, or they glossed over most detail, instead laying out the fundamental aspects of the game like what its controls were or how many enemies and levels were in the game. You know, like those objective reviews some nimrods on Twitter think they want from professional journalists. But what really caught people's eyes were the reviews at the other end of the spectrum. Not 72% or 65%, not the 50s or the 40s. No, we're talking the Amiga Powers of the world. Yes, the mag might have printed a bit of PR voiced preview, but it more than made up for things with a review ending with the sentence, "What an astonishing waste of time." And the score for Rise of the Robots from Amiga Power? 5%. Safe to say Rise of the Robots did not change the world, and it definitely did not have one over on Street Fighter 2. It's 1998, you're making a licensed tie-in to Jurassic Park. Half-Life, Halo, Call of Duty, none of those games exist yet. We are firmly in the Quake era. You can do it, DreamWorks. You can make a first-person shooter that emphasizes story and atmosphere over bravado and bombasticness. One that pushes players to be smart and survival-focused rather than headstrong and gun-violent. You can create a virtual amusement park of fully physically modeled 3D wonder. An open world where players would wander and solve puzzles using the power of physics while not having to execute stegosauruses. See a locked door? beat it down. Boxes need stacking for some reason? Stack them boxes. It would be revelatory, different, unique. And on top of all of it, we would have a game where the dinosaurs weren't enemies. They weren't units put in there for the player to murder indiscriminately. These would be as close to the living creatures as we could ever hope to see in a video game. Artists would study skeletal structure, and using information we had to hand about dinosaurs alongside some good old extrapolation, they would design musculature, skin textures, actual patterns of movement based on all these factors mixed up together. These creatures would look and move the part. But it would be more than that, as Arcade Magazine explained. The game's dinosaurs react to their environment both physically and emotionally, behaving more like sophisticated animals than one-dimensional monsters. Mess about with the food chain and you could be in trouble as your place in it shifts. Yes, these creatures would be motivated by their emotional state, and the food chain could modify on the fly, changing your place in it as you played, making for a more tense game, or one where you needn't worry about being chomped up as all the dinos looking for meat had had their fill. It's no exaggeration to say Trespasser was one of the most hyped games of the mid to late 1990s, and it likely would have been that way even without the Jurassic Park license attached. Such was the scope of its ambition and the volume of its boasts. In fact, the game's director Seamus Blackley, who went on to become one of the lead designers of the original Xbox console, fact fans, admitted he didn't really want to make a Jurassic Park game at all. His experience at Looking Glass Studios on the likes of System Shock had shown that emergent stories would come from games regardless of whether they had a known property attached to them or not. And the worry was throwing Jurassic Park in there would result in the meddliness of movie executives muddying the waters. That fear of interference did come true. Very true. But that wasn't Trespasser's only problem. Blackley himself was touted as an issue behind the scenes, with one developer who worked on the game, Richard Wyckoff, writing in 1999 for Gamasutra that there was a lack of coherent management on the project. Trespasser was made without a traditional or codified design document, meaning it was always prone to whims, and devs had very few ironclad specific goals and ideas to aim for when making it. And so, things started to go wrong. A lot. It was issue after issue, worsened by a sudden need to speed up the frequently delayed project and get it on shelves after a deal with AMD was signed for some reason. Whatever the reason, funding depended on Trespasser releasing for late 1998 after it had seen a series of delays over the months and years. Money shifted things though, and the game had to be finished and out the door by that set point. As it came to be, only one of those two things happened, and it wasn't the had to be finished part. The combination of rushed development and an unclear path in making the game led to something that was absolutely brimming with potential. A game ahead of its time in many ways, like the lack of HUD and the more freeform nature to things, as well as the physics-based puzzles that wouldn't make a big splash in FPSs until Half-Life 2 hit in 2004, 6 years post-Trespasser. There's a lot of love for Trespasser out there still, and I can 100% see why. It was ambitious and, at times, impressive. But it wasn't what was promised, and it was a broken mess at launch. While it was meant to be open world, instead it ended up as a surprisingly linear slog through slightly broader corridors than you'd come to expect elsewhere. Yes, they looked like tree-laden hills, but they were corridors. Initially, the game was meant to be based on build-up physics puzzles, but owing to the engine's shortcomings, these were changed to the easier-to-design, destroy style of physics puzzles. But because of that move, gunplay had to be improved as a way to paper over the cracks of what was clearly a half-baked selection of puzzles. But the problem there was the engine hadn't been written with combat in mind. This was meant to be a survival game where you escaped from dinosaurs in the most part, but now it was having to be redesigned to feature actual proper gunplay, and it didn't quite work. And oh, good crikey, the dinosaurs. As Richard Wyckoff explained in his Gamasutra piece, dinosaurs were governed by a set of emotions which theoretically would prompt them to pick appropriate responses at any time. However, in practice, they would end up oscillating rapidly between many activities, sometimes even literally standing still and twitching as they tried to decide what to do. Making a usable dinosaur required disabling all but one or two of their activities. This allowed aggressive dinosaurs to really be aggressive, but it also meant that the most dinosaurs were as single-minded as the traditional video game monsters we were trying to one-up. And so the combat became even more of a focal point, because the single-minded carnivores would hunt you regardless of how the now non-existent food chain was looking at any given point. Trespasser wasn't a joke. but it was certainly a punchline for a long time after its release. I spoke with Seamus Blackley a few years ago for a feature I wrote for Retro Gamer magazine in which he said, "I was an idiot and I ran the team terribly. I had been very successful at Looking Glass because we had guys around who would ship a lot of games. And when I went to build my new team in Los Angeles, I didn't have that structure around and I really needed it. I think a lot of the stuff was a good idea and a lot of people would copy those good ideas and then make them work right. I was arrogant and I screwed up pretty badly. I made myself into the guy writing all the physics, which was a huge research project. And I did well. I got pretty far compared to the teams of people who did it later, and all by myself. But it was while I was also running a project. That's ludicrous. It was a horrible experience for the team to go through, I am sure." But according to Blackley, the path of Trespasser did lead directly to where we are now. Without the game's failure, he might still be at DreamWorks today, and if he'd stayed there and not ended up at Microsoft, well, I learned a lot, and as a result we have Xbox, to be frank. I mean, that's the trade. Upset about Trespasser? Go play Halo. Safe to say, Trespasser did not change the world. It did earn me a few £100 for writing a feature about it in Retro Gamer though. You might think I've done it on purpose. Everything produced in and around The Matrix has been visually spectacular, including games like Enter the Matrix, so seeing the interference and generally grimy quality of the video here, you might think I'm trolling for cheap thrills. I'm not, I just had to use an unshielded component cable with my Xbox and this was the result. I'm sorry, I've already got to work on fixing the issue, I'll try to be sure it doesn't happen again, and it's definitely not the worst thing someone who makes videos for YouTube has ever done. But Enter the Matrix. Good crikey, the hype for this one was unbearable. Made to coincide with the cinema release of The Matrix Reloaded, and actually produced alongside both Reloaded and the third movie, Revelations, Revolver Ocelot, regarding Neo, whatever that one's called, Enter the Matrix took the usual approach to making a movie game and threw it in the bin with extreme prejudice. This wasn't to be something just based vaguely on some characters from the film with a sound-alike voice actor and 2-bit game mechanics. No, Enter the Matrix would be a whole, complete chapter of the Matrix mythology, written and produced by the Wachowskis, something it would be necessary to consume were you to want to have a full understanding of the franchise's lore. What that translated to was FMV cutscenes with high production values featuring proper actors, some crossover with the films themselves, and a game production that was ultimately rushed way too much and bundled out the door in a particularly underwhelming fashion that inevitably sold 5 million copies because marketing works. Being fair, Enter the Matrix was stylish and at times smart. It genuinely upped the ante when it came to the sorts of cinematic presentation and cutscenes we do take for granted these days, but that's because they were filmed by an actual film crew during production of an actual couple of Hollywood blockbusters by actual filmmakers. So it's no surprise the filmy bits were impressive. What was less impressive was that rushed game bit by Dave Perry's Shiny Entertainment. Equal parts clumsy, dull, confusing and glitchy, Enter the Matrix wouldn't quite be on the receiving end of the ire of gamers truly scorned by the badness they were experiencing, but it would bore most of us into a coma. Not quite the life-changing, free-flowing Matrix-like combat experience we were promised in a world where enemies could be anywhere, the visual fidelity would blow your tiny mind, and the rules of the world could be altered on a whim. We were told we'd be getting the truest example of the Matrix possible in a video game. Instead we got an intensely basic third-person action game with a bit of bullet cam and wall running. Safe to say, Enter the Matrix did not change the world. Silicon Knight's last hurrah, because that X-Men game doesn't count, 2 Human was actually an idea stretching all the way back to around the mid-90s. While it eventually released exclusively on the Xbox 360 in 2008, it was originally intended to be a 4-disc monster, or a 5-disc behemoth depending on what you read, for the PS1. A cyberpunk-style cop game riffing heavily on Blade Runner, this version quietly died a death as the developer moved into the loving embrace of Nintendo. With Silicon Knights working exclusively on GameCube games, naturally this meant 2 Human would now be a GameCube game, except nothing was shown of it ever as far as I can tell, and instead all we got were poxy games like Eternal Darkness and Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes. Ugh, what a waste of time. But then another shift in both publisher and engine, and we ended up with the 2 Human that did actually come out, just for the Xbox 360 using Unreal Engine 3, and now some kind of sci-fi Norse thing rather than a Blade Runner ripoff. This long-winded run-up led to the game getting more attention than it otherwise would have, I think it's fair to say. There's a huge element of curiosity attached to a game that's been in development hell for about a decade, and so there were more eyes on 2 Human than there might otherwise have been. And with eyes on it, the hype commenced. Only, quite strangely, the hype this time around seemed to only come from the developers, mainly from Silicon Knights chief Dennis Dyack, with the press notedly down on the game about a year before it came out thanks to a dodgy as heck E3 demo. In fact, previews just before the game's actual release were sometimes reticent to heap praise on the experience, or, in the most part, engaged in some wonderfully decisive fence-sitting. I feel the game's press really did try to warn us, but it was about as obvious as blinking in Morse code. So what was the hype? Well, 2 Human would be the first of a planned trilogy. It was not, the franchise is dead. It was to feature a combat system that would rewrite the book on how role-playing games handled your fighty smash action. In practice, it was a genuinely dumb system mapped to the right stick that involved hardly any input from the player and offered even less feedback to the player. The world you were making your way through would be huge and gorgeous, featuring the sort of level design that would echo through the halls of gaming eternity. If the echo was the sound of snoring, because by the time you'd seen one location, you had seen them all. The story was from the high-powered brain pans of the folks who'd brought us Eternal Darkness and Legacy of Kain. It would be dark and brooding, it would tell a mature tale. It would be as creative as it was fantastical, and it would slam the Western RPG back on the map with gusto. In practice, the story was wooden, boring, and at times pretty much nonsensical rambling. One big added bonus value point touted was the promise of 4-player co-op. There was no 4-player co-op. Another value-added point was the post-campaign game, which would bring something huge for players to get stuck into even after finishing the core narrative. There was nothing. Depth was a big selling point, with customization key to the game's appeal and much of its hype. There were customization elements, but they were shallow at best. 2 Human wasn't diabolically bad, but it wasn't really any good at all, and following a 10-year wait, it was forgotten 10 minutes after it came out. At least it would have been were it not for Silicon Knights being found guilty of, and I quote the judge here, "deliberately and repeatedly copying thousands of lines of Epic Games copyrighted code." I don't know why I'm being Baron Greenback. This is concerning Unreal Engine 3, by the way. "And then attempting to conceal its wrongdoing by removing Epic Games copyright notices and by disguising Epic Games copyrighted code as Silicon Knights' own." Yes, Silicon Knights illegally used Unreal Engine 3 to make 2 Human, and some other games, and after being found guilty of this subterfuge was ordered to recall and destroy all copies of the game, in a world where Rise of the Robots was allowed to continue existing. Oh, and the studio director, not Dennis Dyack for clarity, was arrested and convicted on charges of making child porn available and potentially other even more serious charges. I couldn't find details, but really it's not something I wanted to spend a lot of time looking into, especially not to just make a pithy comment about it before moving on. Moving on, safe to say 2 Human did not change the world. It did result in the spectacular collapse of Silicon Knights though. I feel a bit mean including this here, to be honest, because I've had a lot of enjoyment out of First Encounters over the years, at least after JFFE and its various imitators started making their way out in the early noughties on. Basically, when the game was fixed. Oops, spoiler for you there. See, Frontier First Encounters was going to be big. Not big like Frontier Elite 2 was, that was billions of galaxies big, so it was already big. No, First Encounters was going to be big, both in the size of the universe and in the array of different activities you could get up to, the missions you could take on, the vistas you could visit, the ships you could fly, and much more. As creator David Braben told Amiga CD32 Gamer, "I do not want people to feel they are getting Frontier revisited. This is a complete rewrite in every way." Worlds would be full of features, cities, mountain ranges, beaches, and coves. Exploration would make you actually feel like you were exploring, discovering new things in places no human had ever been before. Elsewhere, while trading had hardly been touched since Elite 2, there had been a real focus by the developer on upgrading the story experience with more dramatic structure to everything, and a selection of journals amounting to hundreds of thousands of words written for the game fleshing out the story even more, and including units reports at times. It would be a gargantuan universe of opportunity with a captivating story to tell, the hidden threat of aliens to discover, so many routes to explore, many different endings to enjoy, and unlimited potential for all those who played it. Previews were written in such a way that you could almost hear the awe shining through. Writers of the day even managed to not laugh aloud when shown the game's micro FMV sequences, which are now, and clearly were then, really rather... well, you see for yourself.
Come in. We've had a really bad day. The bottom's fallen out of everything. You'll be lucky to unload your cargo hold.
First Encounters could have lived up to enough of this hype for it not to be considered a failure, for it not to be the game that almost killed the entire Elite franchise. Genuinely, it could have. The reverse engineered and importantly fixed versions you can get around the interweb show there's a hell of a lot to like about the game. But that doesn't change the fact that it promised the world, the cosmos in fact, and what we got was a bug-ridden, broken mess of unfinished crap. And I use the word crap for a reason there, which I'll get to in a second. First, I want to go to some of the things that were just comically bad in First Encounters, and to do so I want to revisit something written by one of the world's best writers, Steve Hogarty, who penned this for PC Gamer about 4,000 years ago. It's difficult to talk at any length about First Encounters without your autopilot flinging you into the sun. Hammering the save button is the only way to circumvent the myriad game-ending glitches that hang over your space captain's head like a cosmic sword of Damocles. You can become inexplicably marooned on remote planetoids, your government accolades, merits and military ranks can spontaneously vanish, and the autopilot considers colliding with a planet's surface at 4,000 kilometers per second an acceptable conclusion to a 2-month-long space journey. All this before you even encounter a genuine enemy ship, the AI of whom implored them to cartwheel giddily towards you on a dopey kamikaze run. Sorry to Steve for that impression. See, GameTech, publisher of First Encounters, needed money. It wasn't doing well financially, so it released Braben's game without his approval, according to accounts from the developer himself. In fact, Braben claimed what was released to the public to be sold for money was actually an unfinished beta version of the game. It immediately stank up the joint, resulted in long-running court disputes, and still, to this day, it's hard to get a straight answer out of people as to what actually happened there. The one thing that was undeniable though was that First Encounters was an abject failure at launch, after promising so very much leading up to its release. Which leads us back to the crap we mentioned before. I spoke to David Braben about First Encounters a few years back, and he said these words. It was awful because you can't talk about it because of non-disclosures. You can't go into detail. People just assume your game was a bit crap. The trouble is, it was a game with our name on it that, frankly, was a bit crap. And how many other list-making YouTubers actually conduct interviews with the people they're talking about in their videos? Yeah, exactly. Anyway, safe to say, Frontier First Encounters did not change the world. Just like Star Citizen won't. Special thanks to my darling Patreons for supporting the incessant need I have to make videos about games from the past. If you want to support the channel, you can do just that, the link is below, or search Bransfield on Patreon. All support is gratefully received, plus you get early access to new videos, and dare I say it, I'm trialling things like early cuts and outtakes being posted there too, so there is sometimes additional exclusive material. What fun! Anyway, thanks for watching, bye!